As a cybersecurity analyst, you've been tackled to identify and validate vulnerabilities. What does that entail? Stick around to find out.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We are talking about vulnerability identification and validation as a part of CySa Plus. And here to tell us a little bit about things like asset criticality, Dan Lowry. Where do we start?
Yeah, good question, Wes. First, I want to start with, I loved how in the teaser you used the word tackled, and my mind just went to Terry Tate, office lineman, right? I'm waiting for Terry to come out and just plow both of us over.
Body check.
That would be a great way to validate whether or not you are vulnerable. I'm here to tell you, Terry, you are. Yeah, to Terry, you are. Let's start off with asset criticality. I think it's a great place. And remember, what we're doing today is kind of like figuring out the things that we need to know and do to prepare and actually perform a vulnerability assessment and scans, right? So that's kind of where we're at. We want to be able to have that conversation and understand each one of the pieces that come back and that we work with inside of our vulnerability assessment and scanning mechanisms. So that's where we're going to go with. And with asset criticality, it's really one of those very first steps that we need to figure out. Because ultimately, we need to come up with a prioritized list of things to do once the results have been returned, okay? And having asset criticality is going to help out with that very much so. So what basically it boils down to is, and hopefully you're already probably getting this, it's another one of those terms that embellishes its own definition in, right? You have an asset, it's going to be a server, a network equipment piece of some sort, maybe a switch or a router or whatever, right? A desktop, a laptop, mobile device, take your pick, right? And I need to understand how critical is this to our system if it were to be compromised. So if I got full compromise against this device, this system, what impact would that have? So I want to gauge that and come up with a list of assets and then put them in labeled them critical, maybe not so critical. You come up with a scale or grab one from online or whatever. That's fine. As long as you might even have one in your organization already. So just use that because those definitions have already been done. And label these things. We have to understand what they're going to be so that when we start to get into actually looking at the vulnerabilities that we discover, if those assets are showing as if something were to highly impact this thing, we'd have a real problem. Well, that's going to bump it to the priority list.
So let me take this. If you're talking criticality, Dan, I'm thinking, okay, so we've got an office, we've got some cubicles, right? Now, criticality here, maybe the chairs, they're assets, we own them.
They are?
But maybe not as critical to, protect them against vulnerabilities like a leg breaking within the chair versus the laptops that are sitting at those cubicles that somebody could maybe walk away with, right? So we got to kind of prioritize.
That's exactly right, because we don't want to spend all our time wasting it away on things that aren't, could happen, or it would be bad if it did, but it wouldn't be critical to the business, right? So that's really what we're looking at. So that's what we want to take into account when we think asset criticality. Okay.
Yeah, so I do know that we've talked about different scanning, and we're going to talk about different types of scans, many different platforms, I'm sure, throughout CySa Plus. Now, one of the things that I do understand is that the type of scan in any platform that you run really is going to dictate what you're scanning and the results you get. Can you tell me a little bit of, between the difference of active and passive scanning?
Yeah, and that's a great question. I'm glad you're bringing it up here, and it is in the objective list for CySa Plus, so it's good on them for making this a part of that. But it can be confusing for a lot of people. So what we mean is, because here, let me put it this way. Here's how I used to think of it. If I'm scanning, that is a verb. I am doing something, therefore I'm active, right? This is something I'm engaged in doing. Don't think of it that way. This is not one of those times when the definition is embezzled into the actual words itself. What we're talking about is let's start with passive scanning. Maybe if we deliver what passive scanning is, then understanding the difference in active scanning will become more clear. So with passive scanning, what I'm doing is I'm going to scan for things that the devices or the system or the organization or whatever is freely kind of telling everyone, right? So I'm not doing anything to elicit that information other than to just go, hey, is there anything going on here? Just a very basic, low-level idea. Is there any ports or services open? web servers advertise the fact that they are open because they're web servers that are meant to be accessed from the outside or from the inside or whatever, right? People need to access the web. That's why somebody spun a web server up. They wanted something or someone to gain access to the information that's available from it. So the fact that it is telling me there is a web server here or a service that is running HTTP is fine, but that is a passive scan. I haven't done anything crazy to try to figure that out, right? It's just, there it is. It's a thing. I just had to look to see that that's what it does. And I think that is the best idea of what passive scanning is that you're just looking. If I walked by a building and I looked inside the window, that's passive scanning, right? What else? It's used for asset discovery a lot of times. So if you're coming from that asset criticality, you probably already engaged in some of this passive scanning, looking for those assets so that you can label them in a way that makes sense and is helpful to you as you do your vulnerability assessment. So that would be included with a passive scan a lot of times is that, okay, how many assets? What are those assets? And what did I do? I didn't do anything crazy. I just looked. Who's out there? And somebody replied back, right? Now, let's take the analogy of me looking into that window, right? Passive scan. There are some lovely jewels inside of that store. And now I am like jiggling the door handle and I'm working the lock. This is more of an active scan. I'm actively doing something to try to get into. If somebody set the jewels outside, I wouldn't have to do much activity other than the stealing part if I was a thief, okay? That would be the risk. The risk of putting jewels outside is you risk theft. And it would be a very high probability that that would occur. But once you put it behind closed doors and put a lock on the door, now you've mitigated some of that risk, but there's still some passive information that can be gained. I can see what kind of jewels they are. Again, going back to our IT idea, is I am seeing, what kind of systems you have and what they're running. What are the services there, right? So that's that passive side, whereas the active side is, now that I know that that's happening, I want more information. So I'm going to start trying to elicit information so that I can find a vulnerability, right? So there's the difference between active and passive. Hopefully that clears that business up. Here's a couple of things I want to do. Let's jump onto my computer real quick. I've got some websites pulled up for us to take a look at. This is Tenable. Tenable, know it, use it, love it, learn it. You and Tenable should become synonymous with your brain thinking, right? Connect in some way, shape, or form. Because you're going to want to know that company. It's a great company because they own the vulnerability assessment tool, which is Nessus, right? A great tool. You'll see the Nessus network monitor is where I want to start here. We're going to take that idea of passive scanning. We're going to try to automate that with Nessus. And it has this lovely Nessus network monitor right here. What's funny is the previous name for this was the passive vulnerability scanner, which I thought was super apropos for what we're talking about here. But they've changed it now to the Nessus network monitor, which is a module for Nessus. So if you have a license for that, you will have access to this, or you might be able to even purchase modules. I'm not 100% sure on their billing and the way they work with licensing for that kind of stuff, but it's really cool. It will do those things. It says it illuminates blind spots so you can see and protect your entire environment. The product provides a safe and non-intrusive way to discover and monitor even the most sensitive of systems. That sounds great. That is something that I would want to do if I were doing a vulnerability assessment, because the less intrusion that we can perform and the less, especially against highly sensitive assets, the better. So that would be probably something I would get on my radar. But there you go. There's at least something you can kind of sink your teeth into, or at least know that it's out there for you to play around with when it comes to passive scanning. That being said, active scanners are more likely what you're going to be doing a lot of stuff with. So let's jump back in. Let's look at another website. And guess what it is? It's Tenable. We're back, right? We've gone full circle, even though we didn't hardly go anywhere. And this is the Nessus family. We have a couple of different scanners. This is, by probably most people's estimation, the gold standard of vulnerability scanners, okay? So, and they do that active part where it is actively trying to elicit those pieces of information that would allow it to know, hey, this could be a real issue, and it's going to return those results to me in a report that I can then verify and check out. So here we go. this is great, right? So Nessus comes from, I don't know if you know this, Wes, but I used Nessus way back in the day when I first started fiddling with security. Nessus has been around for a long time, and it used to be like bone free. Everything, free 99. Didn't cost you a dime. And it was the full on everything. And then Tenable purchased it and they made it a pay for product, gave it a little more professionality. And I remember working with Nessus back in the day and me going, it came back with a lot of stuff. Most of it's informational. I don't know what to do with this. It was obviously some homebrewed thing, but it gained a lot of popularity if you understood how to use it. I think that's why Tenable ended up purchasing it. And then they really put a coat of polish on it. And it's a really nice platform. But they still have a free tier, which is this Essentials right here. You can use it anywhere. I highly recommend get some hands-on with Nessus Essentials. It's not too difficult to get spun up. Need a little bit of RAM and some resources just because it's going to do some intensity. I got it running on, I think, a Windows box right now. Works great. It's a phenomenal scanner. Looks really good. Great. But you also have the professional. You can scan unlimited IPs, and then you have Tenable IO, which is like managed in the cloud, and it's kind of going that cloud route. So be prepared. Those are ones. What else do we have here? We've got Open Files, which I think we've seen already in the show, if you're watching these in order anyway. Another vulnerability scanner. Free. I do love giving you good guys out there and girls resources that you can use. Get some hands-on, because that's what it's all about. So spin up an Open Vise. You can try it out. This is the best way to go, in my opinion. The virtual appliance, because then you just download that and then go through like VirtualBox or VMware Player or Fusion if you have it or whatever you got, run it and you're done. You just play with it and it's a lot of fun. The last one would be like Qualys. I always want to say Qualys. It's Qualys, which is a cloud-based. It's kind of like Tenable IO, where you're up in the cloud managing vulnerability assessments that way. So just want to give you some familiarity with that those are things that you could use to do. Those are active scanners. Okay. So there you go. Active scanning. Hopefully that makes some sense.
Oh, absolutely. And there's one term that, I know we've kind of talked about before, and especially in passive scanning, where you talk about enumeration. Now, I know enumeration, Dan, in general, just general, is determining the number of something. So if my wife is at home and she's, let's say, enumerating the household income, trying to figure out what our bills are for the month. Now, how does enumeration apply to vulnerability identification and validation? And that's not the only word used for enumeration either.
Yeah, sometimes you see it as like we're mapping, but enumeration is really what we're getting at. And when we're talking in cybersecurity, what we mean by enumeration is I want to know what kind of services are being run. Not only that, but what version of the service, what's the software that's actually running the service. And the more of that kind of information, and this kind of goes down that pike as we go from passive scanning into more active scanning and then trying to understand, get a lay of the land for actual technologies that are being used. I want to make a list of that. If I am a defender or an attacker, this is something that we need to engage in. I need to know exactly what software is being used on every asset that we are using, what the criticality of it is, what is the version that's being used, because I'm going to use that information to better defend our network. And you say, well, how do we do that? Well, let's take it from the attacker side. If I'm an attacker, I'm going to come at it and go, okay, they're running, I don't know, Apache Tomcat version such and such, right? Well, I'm going to go out into the interwebs, or maybe I've already got a bevy of exploits that work against, or I'm going to use a scanner that tells me, hey, just like what we're looking at right here, right? We're scanning for vulnerabilities. Now, the difference between the attacker and the defender is the attacker is going to use that information to try to gain access to the system, whereas the defender is going to use that information to try to better secure the system. How does that work? Great question. Well, obviously, the attacker, if they have an exploit for that known version of that piece of software, they're going to deploy it, and if everything goes well, they will then have access of some sort. The defender is going to say, wow, we're running Apache Tomcat version such and such, which I see has known vulnerabilities. Now I need to do something about that. So I will apply a patch, I'll go to a different vendor, do all sorts of, we'll talk about really get into mitigations in another episode, but ultimately, that's what we're trying to do. If I know what the services and things are, right, and then go even deeper as we do active scanning and learn if there's any vulnerabilities associated with those devices and those softwares and those technologies, well, then I'm going to be better prepared because now I can make a prioritized list of what's the worst thing that could happen. This seems to be the worst. Let's start there and go on and so on and so forth. So that's the idea of doing enumeration. It is a key. I cannot stress you'll probably hear this a lot, and it gets old. It gets tiring. It's like enumeration because I'm just gonna say it, Wes. It sucks. It's not a fun activity to get into because it can be difficult enumerating things. But it's a highly necessary thing because the more I know about a system, the more likely it is I can find a way in, or I find that I need, that's a problem. Someone could find a way into there. And so the more I find, the better defended I could be because I know of those vulnerabilities.
You know, Dan, it seems like enumeration is one of the major tasks, many of major tasks, I'm sure, when it comes to identification of a vulnerability. But now we've got this list. All right, we've got a spreadsheet, if you will. We've identified it. How do we validate it? Because that's the second part of this coin, the second side of this coin in this episode.
Yeah, unfortunately, our scanners are not sinless perfection. They, from time to time, will give you a report that here is a critical vulnerability. You guys are about to get hosed. Big time, you see big red, critical or high or whatever it is, right? That lets you know this is a real problem. And then you start trying to batten down the hatches and you think, I'm not even running this. Why did this, right? The scanner is a tool. It can only work within its own confines. And as we know, software isn't perfect. From time to time, it will make a mistake, right? So we have to get into the idea of validating these results that it gives us. Just because we let a scanner automate some things doesn't mean we're not going to manually do stuff, right? And even going back over what the scanner said it found to verify that that actually exists. So if it said I had an Apache Tomcat issue, I go, we're not running Apache Tomcat. Why are you giving me a Tomcat problem, right? So this is what we would call a false positive. And there's actually quite a few, well, there's four of them. I say quite a few. There's four of these different types of things. And I've made the list so I don't forget any of them, even though there's four, because your brain can get chewed around. You got a true positive and a true negative. You got a false positive and a false negative, right? What does that mean? Really quickly, true positive means it is true, right? It's not only true in theory, but it is true in actuality, in reality, okay? A true negative means that we say that this is not a problem, and that is true, right? Pretty simple, straightforward. Those are probably the easiest ones to wrap your mind around. Basically, it means this is true or that is false, and it's true that that is false. Hopefully that makes sense. I know it's weird, right? Then we get into false positives and false negatives. A false positive would be like that thing, the scanner telling me that we have an Apache struts issue and we're not even running Apache struts or Tomcat or whatever, right? Or it's been patched or something. That's a false negative. Now, some of those false negatives I'm going to have to go back and validate manually, as we were talking about before. I'll have to look into it and go, are we running Apache struts or Tomcat or whatever it said that we had? Let me go look. Let me look at that box, pull up the services. Oh, yeah. Oh, and you might find yourself surprised at some of the results. But that's why we do validation, right? And then, of course, there's the false negative where it said, this is not a problem. And it's a problem. It's not good. So again, reasons that we engage in the validation process is that we trust but verify what the scanner has told us, especially when it comes to those critical and high-level vulnerabilities that it might have elicited. So there you go, Wes. That is validation of why we do it and what some of the terminologies around how we verify these things.
You know, Dan, let me see if I can throw something in here. I know that I've looked at this and I said, man, how am I going to try to remember this as a student here? I always think of true as correctly identified and false as incorrectly identified.
That's a great way to do it.
It's just, that's what seemed to me to work for me on this, because I'm a student like you all are out there, and boy, that can get a little bit twisty. You know, we've talked about a lot of concepts and we got more concepts to come. Remember, in this episode, it's about the identification and validation of those vulnerabilities through asset criticality, right? Passive versus active scanning. We've talked about mapping and enumeration. And then finally, the validation of those vulnerabilities. All right, that's going to be pretty much it for this episode. But before we wrap it up, you got anything additional you'd like to throw in there, Dan?
No, I understand that these things can be kind of tricky when it comes to, because there's some nuance to them, but just spend some little time with them and make sure that you've got it solid in your brain. You should be fine when it comes to the exam.
All right, stay tuned, because we've got plenty of more content coming up in the upcoming episodes of CySa Plus. Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.